Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and you're listening to the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, where we bring you audiological ingredients so you can brew your own faith. You know, one that's not wussy, tasteless, gross, and light. That's right. Anyway, today on the podcast, you're going to hear me talking to my friend, mentor, and philosophical theologian, philosopher of science, and partner in crime, Philip Clayton. And he's talking in this about how we do constructive theology in the face of all the different critical barriers, you could say, in our contemporary postmodern situation, for lack of any word that has somewhat more explicit meaning. Anyway, before we jump in, I just want to say this podcast is sponsored by the National Summit to Reimagine Theological Education. That's right, it would be a summit, bring people together across the nation, hence National Summit, to reimagine theological education. It's October 9th through 11th in Chicago. Just go to theoedu.org to find out more information. There's going to be a lot of fun there. Phil's going to be there. My friend Jeremy's going to be there. The elder of the Hops, Tim's going to be there. But if you're in Chicago, you should check it out, because there's ways you can participate, like for a day, for some fun live event, or if you want to be a minister or a provocateur of looking at the different shape of theological thinking in the church, then there's all sorts of different ways you can participate, be there. So do it. I'm excited to talk to Phil, and I just want to say I want to see you. There's a lot of different events coming up, speaking engagements and things, especially with my new book coming out November 1st. That's right, Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus, Lord, Liar, Lunatic, or Just Freaking Awesome comes out. And I'll be going around talking about it and stuff. Some live podcast events. October 21st here in Redondo Beach, California is the God Debacle. That's right. It's neither a conversation nor a debate, because it's a debacle. And it's a God debacle because we're talking about God, cognitive science of religion, philosophy. Can you argue for the possibility, legitimacy, or even necessity of there being some ultimate reality behind the phenomenon of religion? Or is it explained away through evolutionary science, through cognitive science? It's a good debate because, child of atheist turned philosophical thinker Phil's going to be there, who you're about to hear from, and Phil is going to be talking to his friend, used to be an evangelical theologian, tenured and such, LaRon Schultz, who's gone the way of God after Altizer got done with killing the deity. Anyway, you have them there. They're going to the throwdown, debacle style, about God, October 21st. And if you come out to LA to come, we're having a happy hour before. It's like a happy hour prior to discussing God, because you don't want anyone to be too wound tight when you start debating the existence of God. We don't want things getting to fisticuffs. No, definitely not. Because I don't know what I do. Phil's tall. He has a sweet stash. LaRon has like sexy bald head. So I would just be like cornered or something. It would just not be good. Not good. So anyway, go to the website, because you can actually stream the whole thing live for free. Just sign up. You'll get the day of a little linky. You click through the email address that signed up. Clicky, and boom, you're here digitally live. You can also tweet, Facebook and stuff about it, and you get entered to win a bunch of their books. Like I have 4 sets of books, all over $100 each total, for people that share about the event. You're welcome to share and not watch. I don't know why you would, because your friends would watch, and then they'd ask you about it, and you're like, I just wanted some free books by the people I didn't want to watch. See, poor life decision. Anyway, share, sign up. Then, I'm going to be talking about the book a lot. November 1st, I'm preaching in Oklahoma, outside of Oklahoma City. Then on the 2nd, I'm doing a book release party and interview with Greg Horton. He's interviewing me about the books at Tapworks in Oklahoma City downtown. The next night, I'll be in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Then the next day in Springfield, Missouri at Brentwood Christian Church, Jack Caputo and I are doing a 1-day theology nerd boot camp about God. Then, or the next day, it's the beginning of Subvert the Norm. Use code HBCSTN to get a discount. And at Subvert the Norm, the 5th through the 7th, I'll do a keynote thing that Thursday morning. That night, live podcast is going to be crazy. And just packed full of excitement. So, yeah, come see me. After I leave Springfield, I'm going to Arkansas, Arkadelphia. So if you're a pig and you're sitting around saying "suey, sue pig," then I'm going to be in Arkadelphia. You should tell me, so that way we can hang out. That's a lot of things going on. There are others. We'll just talk about it later. Anyway, so yeah, the book's coming out. You should pre-order it, and if you go to homebrewedguides.com, you can pre-order the whole series with the cheapest you'll get, cheaper than Amazon with free shipping and swag and such attached to it. So homebrewedguides.com, do it. And if you work at a library or are worth large amounts of money, and you want me not to cry so often about the failure that is my existence, you can buy 40 cents. That is permitted. That's permitted. If you're a homebrewed Christianity deacon, elder, bishop, if you get the whole set, then just send me your email when you got it, and then I'll Skype in and talk about one of the books with you in your reading group. See? Doubling up the perks for the people that help keep this podcast free. Well, unless you give every month. For everyone else, that there are 40,000 and some people who don't pay, so you should thank the 100 and some that do. And you can do it by buying my book. I don't know how or not they will decide whether or not that was helping, but there are dots to be connected. Anyway, so Enfolding Spirituality is happening out here in Los Angeles. You should come to that too. And that, the way we can hang out, there's going to be a live podcast. And who doesn't want to talk about integral evolutionary panentheism, November 12th to 14th? And if you use the code HBC, you get a discount there too. That's what I'm talking about. I just want to hang out with you in the near future. I'll even hang out with you if you didn't buy my book. But if you bought 2 of them, I'll give you a back rub. Maybe. Not if you don't want one. So Philip Clayton is on the podcast, and he's going to talk about his book, Predicament of Belief, which he followed up by writing a book about people engaging the predicament of belief where they argued with him. And if you think the arguments in that are intense, just wait till he and LaRon debacle. Because if you debacle about God, junk gets real. That's right. All right. Trip Fuller. That's on Twitter. Which you should get on Twitter if you're not, because there's this new app called Blab. It's like 4 heads streaming, talking to each other on the internet. And Peter Rollins and I were hanging out and playing with it last night. And we've decided at some point in the near future, we're just going to get on Blab and then tweet about it, and people get on, and we'll just rotate through people asking us any question, and we'll attempt to take it seriously. Right? So, I mean, you could ask, why is there something other than nothing? But you could also ask about the ontological significance of Lysol. Anyway, Homebrewed Christianity Peace. This is Trip, Philip Clayton. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity. This is Trip, and today I'm getting to talk to mentor friend, scholar, philosopher, theologian extraordinaire, Philip Clayton. How are you doing, Phil?
Hey, doing great. Thanks for having me on the show, Trip.
Oh, it's always good to have you on the show. And as much as it is fun to hang out with you, I'm just thinking that if I was going to be in Chicago in October, then I would know I could hang out with you.
Hey, I know. Well, we're going to try to get you out there one way or another. It's the first time that we've been able to get people together who really have a vision for the future of theological education, the kind of stuff that the blogs are all about on Homebrewed, but now to do it at the nationwide level with a chance to really make a difference.
Yeah, so it's part of the larger Convergence Network and a particular grant you're working on. Jeremy Fagenthal is a part of it. So what in the world is wrong with theological education, and how do you plan on changing it? Because I'm already getting nervous, Phil. I've student loans. I've spent a lot of time reading books and writing papers for you, and now you're like, it's old, it's dead. We got to figure out something new. Does it pay off student loans?
Well, I think the most important thing is nobody else is a victim in the way that you've been a victim.
That's what I like to hear.
Over the last years. But no, I mean, come on. Why would you think there's anything wrong in theological education? In order to train people for ministry, you take them out of their ministry context and put them in a place for 3 years.
Yes.
You give them a system that was invented in the early years of the 19th century by Friedrich Schleiermacher for a bunch of German Lutherans at the University of Berlin.
Amen. Amen.
You have a relatively conservative accrediting organization run by the stakeholders, maintaining their own status and resisting change.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have cost. The class is taught by academics whose guild is academic and whose ministry experience is less important, who are tenured for life no matter what they do, except a few no-nos I can't mention on the air. And finally, you do the whole thing with such a cost that the people carry such debts that when they get a call to ministry, they have to decline it so they can pay their cost for learning how to minister.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't that be a great system?
I don't know. I mean, the way you're talking about it just makes me think, why can't we duplicate that for every vocation?
So what's really interesting is that off the record, seminary professors, deans and presidents are telling me the system's broken. We'd love to change it, but we just can't do it. And so if you begin from the heart of the existing system, you won't see the change. But if you draw together people who get it about ministry today, people who are practitioners, ministers working in traditional and non-traditional contexts, and theologically interested people like the ones on Homebrewed who get a sense for what a powerful form of Christian reflection would look like, you really could do it. So Convergence was the natural home. The Carpenter Grant gave us the chance to get started. And we're launching now a series of 5 national summits to see if we can't actually get this work done between October 9th, next month when we start, and 5 years from now when we end.
So what's happening at the first summit?
So the first summit is already beginning the movement towards something new. The idea is to feature the 24 most innovative programs in ministry education, theological education, in the country. So they'll be giving TED Talk style presentations. And then a lot of chance for feedback groups, breakout groups, workshops. What's really interesting is that this one mingles the young Turks with the establishment. So ATS will send their representative of a $6 million grant that they're using to look at theological education. Stephen Lewis will keynote from the Forum for Theological Exploration. And there'll be a number of others who see the new model. And this will be the chance to look at the question, do we innovate within the old framework, or do we need to reinvent structures and approaches from the ground up?
And you're going to bring them all together in a giant kumbaya theme?
I think the sparks are going to fly. And that's why we need Homebrewed folks to be a part of it, because they're the ones who won't be shy about raising the needs, about asking whether the emperor has clothes, and about talking about models that already are out there and successful. Like perhaps you'll mention somewhere along the way the hatchery. We're just doing a presentation.
Yeah, I know about the hatchery. Their director for theology and the humanities is just amazing. So where do people go if they want to come hang out, hear the experiences, hear the presentations, engage and interact?
Yeah, so we hope people will come Friday to Sunday. That's October 9 to 11. The website is theoedu.org, theo and then edu.org. And we try to keep registration costs really low. And if people can only make it drive in for the Saturday or something, then they can do that for just $39. So the idea is to get a lot of people who are stakeholders, who have the vision for the future, and give them access to what forums from which they're normally excluded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the groups that is going to be a really good resource are ministers serving in churches that are realizing what worked and didn't work from their own education and are invested in the long-term vibrant health of the church, figuring out how to do it better.
Exactly. If the majority of the people in the room are actual practitioners, people ministering in congregations or in other forms of ministry situations, it will completely change the tone and the message will get through. But if only the traditional educators show up, we won't see change.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to jump in and talk about some fun stuff. You wrote a book called Predicament of Belief, and then you and Stephen Knapp got a lot of people riled up, and then you had to write a follow-up about Confronting that said Predicament of Belief, and then you go and get Laron Schultz all worked up on the internet at Syndicate Theology's kind of blog about his book on the birth of God, and now y'all are going to have a little God debacle on Wednesday, October 21st. If you're in LA, you can come live or stream it online. You can sign up. It's on the internet. So you like engaging in philosophy, science, and theology.
Mm-hmm.
And you tend to make lots of allies and lots of enemies in all three different conversations and how they overlap. So maybe before you jump in, just to say a little bit about why in the world would you want to have to dialogue with all three? I mean, that's if figuring out how to do one is difficult enough. But what is gained or what is involved in figuring out how to interact with religion, with science, with philosophy, with particular historic traditions? How do you see that conversation connecting? What are the questions that drive you to actually engage in it at each level?
Yeah, and actually, I have to answer your question in a sort of personal way. So I attended fairly conservative schools, Westmont College in Santa Barbara and Fuller Seminary. At that time, more conservative maybe than it is now. And what I was offered by the academy were these three different silos that I worked in. And in the discussion of philosophy, it had its own internal logic and standards. The sciences were running on their own and receiving increasing status, and beginning to tell the rest of the disciplines that they didn't really count, because once we knew science, we knew everything that was important to know. And then, at least in my world, Christian theology was done in a very inward-looking direction. It constantly seemed to take either scripture as a closed world that you had to inhabit and never question, or Barth's theology or Reformation theology or whichever particular program. And then I had this fourth influence called the gospel. And this amazing guy who in the first century wouldn't be pigeonholed and wouldn't do the silo thing. And in fact, he was all about deconstructing those boundaries. So it struck me gradually that it was a sort of, we hear God or mammon, but I'll say God or modernity. I could accept the modern specialization into little categories and let God get chopped up to the role that God could play in each one. Or there could be the God notion itself, or the discipleship notion itself, could blow up the distinctions and cause us to think more synoptically across the categories. So my career was launched with the dissatisfaction at the modernism I got in my conservative evangelical world.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I constantly run into is probably just because of the friends I have, but is that the desire for philosophy to be done in a robust way so it can engage the sciences, religious traditions, pluralisms, and the particular confessions and commitments of your own kind of situatedness as a Christian. That now, like in our postmodern context, that just desire is sometimes critiqued. Like it's ethically problematic, or it's extremely naive about the power of human reason. Or, I mean, there's lots of different critiques. And in Predicament of Belief, you're trying to not just dismiss them and go, whatever, you go sit in the corner with Derrida and have your fun because no one really knows what in the world you're talking about. And I'll go back and read Shakespeare and not cry. So, like, what is it that how do you understand kind of the pushbacks to this desire and your own vocation as a philosopher of science, but also belonging in a religious tradition?
Yeah. So let me put it a little bit dramatically, but in a way that I think is justified. There's a battle going on for the soul of postmodernity. Postmodernity was launched, we often associate it with the 1984 book on the postmodern condition by Lyotard. For Lyotard, the most important premise for postmodern is no meta-narratives. So you abolish the modern specialization and the siloization, but at the cost of not being able to speak anything that might sound like a meta-narrative. That's what I think is the deconstructive or the mistaken approach to postmodernism. There's another form of postmodernity, which is very different. And that is that nobody gets to capture the flag. Nobody gets to own the truth category for their particular perspective. We have to grant, as Donna Haraway, the feminist philosopher, says, that all knowledge is situated knowledge. Ironically, she wrote that in the same year that Lyotard's book was published. What does it mean that I grant the situated standpoint that I start with? It means that as I try to think synoptically, I never deny that particular moment or place that I have as a thinker. Language, gender, culture, historical location, and for me, clearly religious location is central. So I actually think that this denial of meta-narratives was mistaken. We need to speak and think synoptically, but we need to do so in such a way that we don't falsely claim as if ours is the only perspective. We don't falsely claim that we possess the only God's eye point of view. And in that case, then, we can and must range, I'll say freely, crazily, across the disciplines. Mm-hmm. The word God requires it. It's just we had to free God first from a modern specialization, fragmentation, and then second from a postmodern discouragement that eviscerates any content from that term whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. So when if the critique of meta-narratives ends up setting up this less than positive relationship across disciplines and things, I wonder, could you say what you're saying is like it's a critique of mono-narratives? Like recognizing like this, human beings are narrated creatures. Like that's part of what we do. Like every therapist knows this. Every religion knows this. Every item that the consumer capitalism is trying to sell you knows this. All we're done, like our existence is having narratives put upon us and us creating them back and forth and figuring out how to negotiate them. Healthy families negotiate their narrative. To me, like it shouldn't be like super weird to think that regardless of how Leotard's received, the narratives have a better staying power than a critique's going to. But go ahead.
And narratives are not tame animals. Narratives can't be caged. You lock up a lion and you no longer have the lion anymore, which raises certain problems about zoos, but we'll get back to that another time. So narratives range freely across domains. When your story intersects with a story of science or faith or conversion or Buddhism or whatever it might be, you have to tell the story. Mm-hmm. So it's really ironic to focus on narratives and then deny narratives that would range across every area that comes into our awareness or impacts on our meaning making.
Yeah. And so what I think could be helpful is for you to kind of describe where the different elements of kind of a postmodern consciousness comes from, and then what are the generative ways of engaging it. Because short of very few people that actually show up at church on Sundays or in a mosque or whatever are going to engage the questions that are kind of present and then use them to deflate and dismiss the tradition that gives them life and they're grounded and situated in. And so to me, I think it's, well, let's be open-eyed about it. And one of the moves that I've noticed is that, like in the past, and we talked about this in our philosophy of science seminar at some point, like the debates used to be kind of like the theist versus the atheist. And the assumption the whole time, right, is that there's some reason working here. We have these data, we have evidence, and now we're going to marshal them up against each other, and we're going to go back and forth, and we're going to clearly work things out. Someone's going to win, someone's going to lose. And now, because of kind of just awareness, and this is kind of one of the parts of postmodern consciousness that I think is because of false consciousness, because of our recognition of it, there's no longer like a harbor for purely rational objective thought. Like it's hard to develop clear and persuasive lines of argument when you can't even trust yourself. You don't know the motives. Maybe you believe in an afterlife because you fear death, or you see God in all religions equally because you don't want to be a dick to your neighbor who's nicer than you but not in your religion. And in recent times, even the battle over God it has become so porous throughout our culture that Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, and friends all moved in our brains, even if you're a fundamentalist, right? Mm-hmm. Like the people who switch the argument from an argument about God to an argument about the person who either believes or doesn't believe in God. Like there's no place that Phil or Laron on October 21st when we debate could really objectively step out and go, I'm 100% confident that I'm arguing what I'm believing because this is objectively true in the most rational place. And you are not, because there's things operating in us that we're unaware of, unknow of, and the origin of our claims and arguments may be something other than what we're pointing at.
Yeah.
So
maybe we have to start by thinking of fundamentally different ways to begin this process of of thinking across boundaries. And what we face, you alluded to, you should turn off your mic for a sec till your dog stops barking.
Don't worry, it's not on the one that's recording.
Got it. There is, theology finds itself with two different approaches. One is a fortress theology, no allusions to any American publisher intended, a fortress theology, which exists in order to build walls and to protect the people of faith from any possible incursions from outside, any ritual pollution from the surrounding world, which is so anti-Jesus, I don't even know where to start with that one, but seems to dominate churches as qua buildings, qua denominations, qua conservative forces in the United States, right? And then, what can I say? This is a little bit worrisome, but there's theology as hunter-gatherers, which means that we all find ourselves thrown into a forest of chaos, and we need to pick up the pieces that allow us to survive, to interact with the humans and animals that we meet in that environment, and find a way to make sense of the environment around us, right? And rather than that giving any opening to Laurent Schultz, as you might have thought from the metaphor, it actually turns out that in the jungle we exist are religious worldviews, religious ideas, metaphysical arguments and stances, which each of us encounters and takes on in one way or the other. Now, what kind of a style would you engage in if you say no to the fortress theology and recognize that we're always involved in this scurrying around to get the pieces that allow us to survive in a meaningful way in the world? Or you can have a civilization which has an imperialist approach toward other thought worlds, or you can have an approach like the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, whose book on the interpretation of religion has what the German word is verstehen, the need to have empathetic understanding of the various worldviews and approaches that we find around us. Let me just close by saying it's an interesting note to say it's not just theologies that become fortress-based, but sciences can do that work in the same way. So a modernist science is hegemonic in the way that E.O. Wilson's book Consilience is. A postmodern science ranges freely across the natural domain, seeking to understand it in the ways that allow us to engage with it. Now do you see why the book had to do science, religion, or theology, and philosophy?
Yeah. No, and one of the things that I find difficult, or one of the things that's difficult about it is so many people have deep held commitments about God, and so few people have the time, energy, and things to engage in, to get to a point where they trust, right, like their own intuitions. It's like you go to the doctor and you're like, well, I'm glad you went to school for this. I guess this is what the problem is. And they show you a picture of something, you're like, oh, sure, I believe you. But for but doctors and philosophers all have this, like this huge investment that gets into understanding it, and it's really hard for the layperson to do it. And in both of them, lay people just Google things on the internet and think they're an expert as well.
And it's really sad. There's more of that refusal to think inside church walls than outside. And among the nuns, and I think among many listeners to Homebrewed, you have people who are willing and not even willing, have to think that life is so chaotic that if I don't bring my brain along, I'm really shipwrecked.
Yeah. So the kind of the next part of it I want to look at is historical consciousness, because as modernity emerged, we realized that we have like our place in the world, our culture, family, religion, more. It's all rather arbitrary. Like we're thrown in the world, Heidegger style. We wake up, we realize we're a human being, we're born to suffer and die, and now we're figuring out what to do with it, how to make meaning out of it, how to have perfect relationships, enjoyment, not die. And if I was born in Saudi Arabia, you and I would be talking about this conversation really differently. And if I was born 20 years or earlier, or like so much of what we know and hold dear about ourselves is arbitrary. And not only that, we don't even so the idea of teleology, the goal of history and movement there is so difficult. So like, how do we understand historical consciousness and engage it in a way that's generative for still wanting to say the word God and it means something?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. I love to think about that challenge. That's the immediate response when I hear that argument, often called historical relativism, is, all right, we're sunk. Anything that changes over time is now off limits for my beliefs. And usually the first thing that gets axed are religious beliefs or metaphysical beliefs. Oh, come on. We know those change over time. We know they change across cultures. There's nothing we can do to hold on to those. We got to let them go. What we tried to do in Predicament of Belief, and maybe one of the reasons why people have pushed back so hard against the argument, establishment people, is that we said, you can make the affirmations. You can continue to hold beliefs, let's say about the resurrection, just to jump into a really controversial one. And that got us attacked from the left, from the scientific people. And I think we'll find out what Laron Schultz thinks about that in October. And on the other side, we said, but you can't make the same kinds of claims, knowledge claims, that you've frequently made in the past. So you can have the God language, even the resurrection language, even the hope for a future resurrection. But you have to do it with a much more nuanced understanding of the kind of claim that you make. And we actually spelled that out in 6 different levels, from I'm absolutely sure everyone agrees, down the scale bit by bit, until you're into that realm where it's a belief. I actually believe this is true, but I'm making the most humble sort of knowledge claims about it. And I think that's crucial for belief in the 21st century.
And how much of it, one of the things I've noticed is when you actually read early church fathers, medieval scholastics and stuff, they were very aware of the different way in which you hold something by reason. Yeah. So why is it all of a sudden that you're somehow, from the right, like more conservative Christians, like, oh, Phil's just not even really holding to the veracity of the resurrection? Because like even Anselm draws a very big distinction between something that's rationally true and something you give yourself to, or something that demands to be embodied, right? So like the difference between belief and faith are not just we're waiting for the facts to come so it all gets cleared up. That's why like his whole proofs for God are written in a prayer. It's because it actually involves faith, and it's not because he's not a rationalist; he's an annoying rationalist. So, how do you try to describe the tension that's there between going, look, this just like it's not new news to think it's weird that a homeless dead dude rose from the dead. That's always been weird. In the same way, it's always been normal for Christians to recognize that when we talk about God and ultimate reality or something, Justin Martyr has lots of allies, and he's talking about Plato, and he's talking about other religious traditions, and you're borrowing from other philosophers. Then when you're talking about the homeless Jew, it's different. That's just it. And when you're talking about the God's revealing God's goal and dream and hope for the world in this particular event, it's a very different way of relating to it. But the certainty of Enlightenment rationalism isn't to correlate to our commitment embodied as a church and as disciples. So, like, where did it come from that the church all of a sudden collapses belief and faith into this really boring thing that then the best way to figure out where the Holy Spirit is to use a scalpel and a magnifying glass?
Well put. One wonders how we could have gotten it so wrong. And I wonder that even more when I recognize that well before Jesus, the philosophers had already recognized these different ways of knowing. So Plato is in the Republic, end of Book 6, beginning of Book 7, is highly skeptical about the amount of knowledge that we know. And he's got this decreasing spectrum of belief leading down to doxa, or so-called mere opinion, that he's built into his system. Aristotle begins his career with the prior analytics, laying out what really rigorous knowledge is, deductive knowledge. And then he has to write the posterior analytics because he realized nothing in science, or little in science, actually meets those standards. Mm-hmm. And by the time he gets to the ethics, he's insisting in the opening chapters that nothing can be known more firmly than that subject matter allows. Yeah. You see, the distinctions are already built in before Jesus' time. So what did humans do?
Even Kant does it in his third critique. Mm-hmm. Right? Like the third critique is this awareness of a very different relationship when it goes to things like aesthetics.
Okay, so if we were talking about Kant, I would love to explore how the so-called three separate critiques might be the source of the siloization of modern thought, because he tries to divvy up experience into these three distinct ways of knowing, whereas I think we find now that they flow into each other in ways that he didn't acknowledge. Okay, I think, how did the church make the mistake? Maybe Derrida was onto something in the early 1960s, 63, when he published Of Grammatology, because he recognized that there's an illusion when the living, throbbing nature of human being in the world gets reduced to graphe, to written records, because they come to have a kind of eternal status in our eyes. It's some almost irresistible tendency. You write a book, you write a dissertation, Trip, right? And you know that a lot of it is made up, guesswork, and a little bit of it is bullshit, right? And then you write it down, you print it, you put a cover on it, and you say, wow, I've really gotten the final answer on this thing. It's an illusion we can't fight off, like an optical illusion. Christians decided under political pressure to reduce the living, throbbing people of the way, the reality of a daily interaction with God and with each other, to creeds. It means written form. And with that, perpetuated the illusion that they had nailed down God in an irrevocable way so deeply that it seemed we would never escape from that illusion.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use the phrase "nailing down." That is a irony there. Anyway, so what? One of the things I thought of, and I think it was John Cobb that said it, because when he was talking about religious pluralism and what is it? Because he wrote this book on transforming Christianity and the mutual transformation that comes between religions when no longer you say we're all doing the same thing, we're all equally right, equally wrong. You don't say like everyone's grabbing a different piece of this elephant, or you don't do these kind of relativize everyone, or you make them all synonyms and that kind of stuff. But you recognize there is historical particularities of it, and depending on your understanding of God, that's a genuine benefit, right? Like there is something beautiful that you come to understand precisely by it being completely other than you.
Yeah.
And within the Christian understanding of God's relationship to history, there's actually real deal reasons to expect to encounter a hiddenness of God in other religious traditions if the God of Israel is God. And I remember one time John said, one of my favorite things about interreligious dialogue when I'm the only Christian there is no one decides to apologize for their religious tradition. And when Christians get there, they always apologize for believing things about Jesus, for being Christian, and everything any Christian's ever done. To me, it's odd because no one ever comes up to you and says, well, John, I know you've been married to Jean so long, but you do know if a different egg had been fertilized the time you were conceived, you would not have been here. And it's completely arbitrary and historical. And, if she hadn't had a headache this one day and you had Advil and you were able to help and you sat down and talked, then y'all wouldn't have ever fallen in love. And if you hadn't had there are all these little accidents of history, and then somehow going like all these accidents add up to arbitrariness.
Yeah.
And, as opposed to seeing the God's relationship to history, its accidents as God's investments in them, which actually makes them grace. And actually, there's way more than happenstance happening. Can you describe how, like in Predicament of Belief, you do quite a bit of understanding the God-world relationship, where history isn't a kind of a space that exists apart from God, but that God, this panentheistic vision, God as the giver of possibilities and all these things, makes history the very place that God gives God's self, shows up, interacts, and invests in these accidents.
Yeah. So wouldn't it be interesting if the sin against the Holy Spirit is the equation of contingency with relativism? The claim that if something's contingent, it can't be knowledge. If God is self-revealing in a way that tells us something of the eternal nature of God, in a world filled with contingency, then that's got to be wrong. Mm-hmm. In fact, a God who only reveals necessary features of God's eternal nature and nothing else is a God who's not really engaging in relationship with the contingent world at all. We inherited that error from the Greeks, and it rooted itself so deeply in Christian thought and practice that it's shipwrecked many of us along the way. So in the Predicament of Belief, we have 2 chapters on what we call the scandal of particularity. Mm-hmm. And nothing attracts me more to Christianity than the fact that the Christian gospel would embrace absolutely particular, unique, localized, culturally specific aspects. One of the things that moves us most is the phrase Abba, Father. But Abba is an Aramaic word highly specific to a particular context. And we could go on and on. God redeems in and through and in the midst of the world as given, as fallen, in the chaos of our lives. And that's the God that I think is worth turning around, metanoia, and following.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've managed to do 2 of the 5 in 30 minutes. So let's talk about social consciousness. And even if people are unaware that social consciousness is part of postmodernity, they always sense it because it's that haunting feeling that whatever we want to call knowledge is actually a social construction. And we may hold certain truths to be self-evident, but when it comes to the basic concepts like equality for all people, Thomas Jefferson and Barack Obama had very different understandings of the very same line. And that we recognize, like, when we learn things and we learn to use language, we end up adopting the world as it is, how it's opened and closed by our language underneath the world. We're engaging in institutions, systems, powers, and they operate on our imagination. They operate on our physical selves. We know that there's not even a generic human being anymore. We are a humanity awash in difference, and apart from our race, gender, class, and other social structuring kind of particularities and things, it's impossible for us to really grasp any one of us in a way that we would recognize ourselves. And so there's this weird sense that all these social constructions are arbitrary historically, but they're also all that we can hold on to when identifying ourselves and differentiating ourselves from others. And underneath those things, we know there are powers that are lurking there.
Yeah. Isn't that an interesting invitation to a new way of conceiving Christian philosophy? So as a young analytic philosopher, I remember actually with a wry smile how we'd begin to do analysis. And whenever we bumped into something that was a part of our cultural given, then we had to eliminate it because that wasn't worthy of philosophy. And then we began to have power as Christian analytic philosophers and began to form journals. And we had a patron saint named Saint Al Plantinga. And we could begin to follow and form cults, groups of philosophers working together. But
you stitched his picture inside of your tweed jackets. I remember you tried to mark it out, but I still recognize it.
Remember the secret handshake, right?
Yeah.
We're Plantageneans. So there's no solution, there's no little change that's going to get us out of that mistaken understanding of culture and knowledge. And so I think that we should just dive off the diving board completely and to say we're going to reverse that completely. We're going to imagine that culture provides the raw materials for us to do transformative work as Christian thinkers, Christian disciples, Christian leaders. So what if instead of being ashamed of particularity, we embrace it in the way that Jesus embraced the particularity of being a person in a culture, in a language. And we believe that somehow the eternal God was involved in that deepening of particularity. So culture, we've got a cultural moment, 2015. We have a cultural environment. So most of us, North America. We have cultural backgrounds, a conservative church fighting against a liberal church. And what if we actually deepened that and did a kind of, watch out, incarnational reflection and defined that as the core of Christian philosophy, not pulling back with fear that we might be relativized by some part of it. Think of Niebuhr's talk about Christ and culture, right? Let's embrace that it's an incarnational theory and take that as the place where God works redemptively, where salvation begins, where understanding begins, and where the church exists.
Mm-hmm. So when we start to think about the first question that often messes up people's brains if they're kind of coming out of this first naivete of faith, this receiving the tradition gladly and things. It's usually because they meet a friend who's a better human being than them of a different religion. And the temptation, I think, for most Christians is either to feel bad for them and tell them they can ask Jesus in their heart, or to relativize the particularities of each religion in light of pluralism, or make religion a human phenomena and then diagnose the issue or examine it and look at the different traditions and their particularities without any referent applied to them other than anthropology. But what is in Predicament of Belief? You want to affirm pluralism, not collapse the difference of religions, and still end up saying thoroughly Christian things by the end. So how do you generatively engage the pluralist reality without either denying it or taking one of these kind of non-constructive off-ramps?
So imagine 3 stages of deepening incarnational Christian philosophy. The first stage says everything contingent, so culture, needs to be set aside so we can get to the eternal verities of God. The next stage we might associate with Lindbeck's Nature of Doctrine in 1984. I was actually in that doctoral seminar when he presented the manuscript, in those days mimeographed, to Fry and Kelsey and a number of theologians who are well known today, like Catherine Tanner. And we debated. I just come from Pannenberg, so I was far more conservative than anyone else in the room, and was pushing them constantly on a social linguistic approach, cultural linguistic approach that seemed to live in that relativism without needing to connect to language. And in the first traditional Christian language, in that first manuscript, he had an excursus to chapter 3, where he said, well, no individual Christian proposition is true, but if you take the whole kit and caboodle, the whole bunch of it wrapped together, you can say in some mysterious sense that it corresponds to the transcendental veritas, to truth in some way. So that's a kind of halfway motion, which I still think is inadequate. We can take one step further without needing to become old-style propositionalists. And that third, which would be a fourth and mistaken stage, that third stage is to recognize that the culture that surrounds us is permeated with language about God, ultimate reality, what is. It is not non-metaphysical or anti-metaphysical. It's deeply and pervasively metaphysical. I love the metaphor of Neurath's raft, a classic German philosopher. And he said, the epistemic situation is like we suddenly become conscious and we're floating in water, let's say in the South Sea somewhere. And gradually it comes back to us that our boat has sunk and we were thrown off into the water. The sun comes up and we got to figure out how to survive. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is look for a piece of wood, put my arm over it. And then I'm going to look for a couple pieces of wood, string them together with a bit of rope that's floating around, get my body out of the water. Then I'm going to recognize there are others on little rafts, and we're going to begin to pull them together. What if we understood the attempt to understand God's revelation as that process of raft building in the midst of that ocean? I'm never going to say that my raft is the only way to speak of God, but I'm also not going to deny that I can speak of God, which is what I think Laurent doesn't get right yet.
Mm-hmm. So the last one, and this is the one that bothers me more. At some point, you're not surprised humans are humans. But you are surprised that there are humans. And that we're identifying a homeless dead Jew on earth as the image of the invisible God. And he's part of a 13.8 billion year process with 200 billion stars. And like, at what point, what do you do with our cosmic consciousness? Because and still be Christianish. I mean, it'd be real easy to be religious. I think you can be a philosophical idealist. I don't know why Platonists aren't making a comeback. I feel like you could do that pretty easy, because the more we're learning about science, I feel like it'd be easy to be super spiritual or whatnot. But Jesus and a cosmos, what do you do with that?
Yeah. So we've got these billions of stars each in billions of galaxies. We've got oodles of time and contingent evolution. all right, God's not going to be located as the micromanager. God's not going to be located as the cause which controls all effects, at least not the God of the gospel. So God has to be located in and through that world of teeming contingency, which means it could have been different. Cobb might not have met Gene and, become the incredible theologian that he was. So how do we understand that? Let me offer just 3 words. First, grace. What is so beautiful about John Wesley and the Wesleyan tradition is this notion of prevenient grace. There isn't a spot in the universe, an event that you're involved in which God hasn't already permeated it with that divine providential presence, in some way preparing for the next contingent event. I think that's fantastic. Then the second one is what we have in the book called panentheism, that we don't understand God's presence as outside coming into the place, but always already permeating every possible point of space-time in the creation. A creator God permeates the ocean like light that comes and fills it completely. And then the last one is that notion of sanctifying process, which is my Wesleyan process side, I suppose, that with the grace and the omnipresence of God, we are called into an ongoing partnership with God in that process, co-creating the next moment of reality. Now, the skeptic says, you're making it all up. It's a sheer projection. The conservative Christian says God planned it all and you're merely a conduit or a vessel, a pathway to it. But there is something, I think, so incarnational, so basically gospel to the view that in a world of chaos, we and God are together making it up. Mm-hmm. As is often said, it's more like a jazz improv than it is like a classical symphony. And I find the Jesus and the highways and byways of Galilee represented in that view of the world more fully than any other philosophical or theological or scientific framework I could find.
Yeah.
Take that.
Yeah. So when you're thinking about the place this type of conversation exists in the church, in the academy, and in culture, like how have you seen it changed, ways it functions poorly and negatively? Because I know it's clickbait on the internet, but I wonder exactly when it's functioning in a positive way, when it's a negative way, and in what ways Christians, especially how many are in vocations that deal with science, philosophy, interacting with other traditions, and that kind of stuff. How does this conversation function for a disciple in a positive way, regardless of where they serve?
Great closing question. I taught Shane Claiborne yesterday here at Claremont School of Theology, and he has this great quote. He says, all the important things have been said too often. Maybe what's really important is that we start to live them. And I actually think that if we just don't take much more than that notion, God's grace permeates all. God is present to every providentially present to every moment of and every place of the universe, and that we co-participate in God in the sanctifying redemption of the world. I don't need any more words. Now roll up your sleeves and let's go do it. Let's work on experimental community. Let's do renewal of my congregation. Let's do an academic conference. And if we have something like that framework, I think we can, to coin a phrase, move mountains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things I've wondered is, so you get there to say that, or if I say something like that, I always wonder, well, am I saying this to someone who would have thought, I could have heard that 10 years ago and thought, oh, this is crazy. You actually have to answer these questions. Come on, Phil. If you jump back 30 years and you were listening to yourself, you're like, oh, look at Phil wrote all these great books. And now he's just like, join God, love, and help do things. No, that's a great place to get to, but sometimes I think it's hard for us to differentiate the way questions and stuff impact us, and how they're part of our own spiritual life. Trying to explain to someone how doing the research, thinking through that is essentially doxology for you. It's a form of prayer. No one understands reading Schelling as a form of prayer till you do it, and it's a form of prayer. So I always wonder, like, sometimes, you're encountering a student and you're like, yep, I know that you and God are going to have to wrestle with this and figure it out. And other times you're encountering someone there and go, Phil, you're smart. Is there like a semi-smart way to do this? Because I'd like to just go ahead and get back to doing that whole, like, working to justice thing. And then...
Yeah. If I can get one point across, it's what an incredible paradigm shift happens. It's been labeled modern to postmodern. It's been labeled the kingdom of earth and kingdom of God. I mean, it's got its multiple labels. It doesn't matter. Shift happens. Paradigm shift happens. You can do doctrinal discussions in a modernist framework where you possess the truth and the other guys are false. Culture and history are contexts and consciousnesses that are disruptive and should be eliminated whenever possible. Or you can do the same discussion from this standpoint of the focus on how I live my life. I can't, speaking of this upcoming theological education conference, can you imagine what seminary education would be like if we said to people, you don't come and find the a priori context of truth and doctrine and then go out into the world with the gospel, Matthew 20:18-20, and change it. You find yourself with your hands dirty, your sweat, you're covering your brow in the midst of struggling with flawed human beings, including yourself, and you seek some help. And you look to doctrine and scripture and philosophy and science as tools along the way, like the flotsam and jetsam that Neurath found when he was building his raft in the South Pacific. Mm-hmm. And with those pieces, you begin to do something with theology. And man, that gets me excited. Yeah. I want to do theological education of that sort.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it, one way I've tried talking about it is to say that, it used to be kind of like the atheists and theists have it battle it out. But now in light of kind of postmodern consciousness, we have both in us. So like we're simultaneously a skeptic and a believer. And
it's so fun to be schizophrenic because there's more to talk about.
Well, and our skepticism can productively be turned to destructive systems other than medieval theology, right? Amen. Like the way consumer capitalism affects the poor and the planet is a thing to be skeptical about. And maybe its ideology to be heretical towards it. And I think theology can have that productive function, I guess.
Yes, and it's fun to find sin in places you never would have thought it before, like your lifestyle and pattern of consumption. And it's equally fun to find redemption in places you never would have conceived it before.
Like a seminary.
You go too far. You go too far.
I always, in the South, they call them cemeteries. Because that's where your soul goes to die.
Ooh, I used to call it liberal laryngitis. You go to a liberal seminary and you learn how not to preach and what you can't say.
It's true. But
now we're postmodern, so we're beyond that.
Yes, that's right. Anyway, so thank you tons for joining us. And the last thing we should mention is the theoedu.org. It's where they can find out about the event in Chicago. And
I just to say, it's really crucial to have people with the kind of mentality that we've been discussing present in the room, even if they can only make it on Saturday, October 10th, to be a part of raising their voices and helping this perspective come to life, because there's going to be a strong temptation to put theology and churches in museums and present them as they once were with little white cards underneath that tell you about dead stuff.
Well, then we can fight over who's the curator. And but the last thing is it's coming up in October. Well, September is when we start the Epic Reads group. And the first up is Jürgen Moltmann's Crucified God on its 40th anniversary. And in October is when you and I will be walking through it together. So if you're an elder or bishop, then you'll be enjoying that. And then in November at AAR, we get to have fun with Jürgen Moltmann himself.
Awesome.
So I don't know if anyone's ever taken a selfie with him in front of a crowd before, but I'm planning.
Which night is that going to be, Trip?
Friday night at AAR. We have a theater. We rented a theater to avoid the authorities getting disappointed and our generosity of beverages during said live podcast. So if you're in Atlanta anyway, you'll all be invited, and the whole thing.
That's worth driving in 8 hours for, I'd say.
Well, it's also going to be streamed on the internet. There'll be you can sign up, and then you'll get access to the whole video stream and can see.
Let's pack out the theater. I think that we could have a party like it's never been done before at the AAR.
There you go. Well, there are big parties there to compete with,
but they're not half as fun.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Trip, for having me. It's a great discussion.
Awesome.
Take care. Bye.